Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to explain to you how I drafted the perfect fantasy football team for the 2022 season. Of course, on a per-round basis, I'll share with you guys my draft strategy as to why I chose specific positions and also the specific players with detailed analysis as to those players' overall upside in 2022, along with additional statistics as to why I chose an early tight end and quarterback. Not only that, I'll share with you guys the psychological warfare that I utilized in order to force teams that drafted around me to make specific decisions that allowed me to complete the perfect draft for a 2022 fantasy football season. Now, before we go ahead and get into that, I want to remind you guys, if you have not yet already subscribed to the channel, we are on our way to our goal of 60,000 subscribers. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. So if you're trying to get an edge on your league, be sure to subscribe. Also, I have some exciting news regarding Underdog Fantasy. For those of you guys who have not signed up already, go ahead and take advantage of it today, because not only is Underdog Fantasy willing to deposit match up to $100, if you go ahead and sign up to Underdog Fantasy today using promo code Andrew, I will personally send you my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings for a half and full PPR league. Again, these rankings include by tiered quarterback rankings, tight end, running back, wide receiver, kicker, and defense, along with my top 250 flex, which includes quarterback, tight end, running back, wide receiver, along with my cheat sheet that includes all of it in one singular spreadsheet. You can get yourself ready by drafting via Underdog Fantasy and also having my 2022 fantasy football rankings that can get you prepared to draft perfect overall squads for the 2022 season. So go ahead, take advantage of that today by using promo code Andrew or going down into the description and clicking the link. Now, to explain some further details regarding the draft rankings, I will be sending you updated rankings on a weekly basis up until September 4th. Again, September 4th is the final Sunday before the regular season for the NFL begins. So you'll be up to date regardless of when you draft and ready to go to build a perfect fantasy football team. Now, for those of you who are wondering, if in fact you used promo code Andrew in the past, does this apply? 100% yes. If you've gone ahead and in the past supported my channel by using promo code Andrew and signing up via Underdog Fantasy, you probably already have an email in your email box right now via my half and full PPR rankings as of today. So go ahead, check your email. You'll have those ready. So again, be sure to sign up for Underdog Fantasy today using promo code Andrew to not only get the deposit match, get some drafts underneath your belt before your league begins, and of course, get my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into the main topic for today, which is, of course, the perfect draft that I ended up completing here. Let's go ahead and begin by explaining my first round analysis. Obviously, I am the number 3 overall pick in this respective draft, and I went ahead and I selected Christian McCaffrey out of the Carolina Panthers. We've talked about him in the past, of course, with my top 12 rankings video at the running back position. I explained as to how I have him as my number 2 running back going into the year, and in a half PPR scoring format, which is the exact format that Underdog Fantasy plays within, he is my number 2 player on the board, right after Jonathan Taylor. So the fact that Cooper Kupp was still available has nothing to do with my decision making. I knew that as soon as Cooper Kupp wasn't taken second overall, he was going to be on my roster. Now, if you want to hear further details regarding Christian McCaffrey and what I think of his potential in 2022, of course, go check out that other video I posted earlier this week. But this is a player that, in my opinion, could very easily be the number 1 fantasy football prospect in 2022. Over the course of the last 3 seasons, in the healthy games he has played, this is a running back in a half PPR that is putting up 24 plus points a week. That kind of average cannot be maintained by any other player in this entire format, which makes me a very confident decision maker when I'm selecting Christian McCaffrey at the 1.03. So after I make that decision and I've selected Christian McCaffrey, my mind is going right away to where's my second round selection going to go. As I continue to see running backs, tight ends come off the board, obviously, the number 1 thing I think of in the second round is, okay, did Mark Andrews by any chance, by any way fall to me? Unfortunately, in this case, he didn't. And a lot of the running backs that I personally like that are in my top 10 rankings were already selected, except for guys like Leonard Fournette and Nick Chubb. But I wanted to go ahead and gain an advantage. I went ahead and pushed the teams that are at the 1.01, 1.02, the first and second picks of this respective draft. I wanted to push their buttons a bit. I wanted to put the ball in their court and make them make a decision that would determine the impact of my overall draft. Now, you may be wondering, Andrew, why would you allow another team to have this kind of control over your potential future in this respective draft? Well, in my opinion, they had no control. I was daring them to make a selection. I was daring the two teams to the left of me on the second and third round turn to make running back selections. I wanted them to make those choices. Though I've always been someone that continues to preach picking two running backs in my first 3 rounds, I know that if someone next to me is going to load up on running back, that allows me to manipulate them in further rounds because I know exactly what position they have to draft in those future rounds. So in this current circumstance, of course, I went ahead and I selected, in my opinion, the best player on the board. I took Tyreek Hill because number one, I knew I wanted a top tier wide receiver. And regardless of the decisions that were going to be made by the teams next to me, I was always going to come out on top. So to give you some context as to why I chose specifically Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill has been one of the better wide receivers in the National Football League, but this offseason he is going from the Kansas City Chiefs offense to the Miami Dolphins. And a lot of people are worried from the transition of going from Patrick Mahomes, one of the best quarterbacks in the National Football League, to Tua Tagovailoa, who people are very uncertain of in terms of his overall potential. Let me give you some statistics that may give you some confidence as to why I made this specific selection in my second round. Tyreek Hill is going to an offense that has a quarterback who is the number one deep passing quarterback in the National Football League in 2021 in terms of adjusted passing completion percentage with a 55.2% completion rate. Again, this is a quarterback that did not have very many great wide receivers in the past, and you are putting an elite talent on his team. We're talking about a quarterback who, in terms of the deep passing game, had a 18.1 yard per attempt average. That's second in the league, only behind Matthew Stafford in 2021. A lot of people talk about Tua doesn't have the arm strength, Tua this, Tua that. Guys, they're fooling you. He can throw the ball 70 yards. If I can go out onto a field and throw the ball 50 yards, and I sit behind a desk all day, what can you imagine Tua doing on a weekly basis? And when we take into account the impact that Mike McDaniel is going to have on this overall offensive scheme, again, he was the former offensive coordinator of the San Francisco 49ers. The 49ers love to use their respective receiving options as yak monsters, yards after the catch. Again, last season, Deebo Samuel and George Kittle were both top 12 in yards after the catch in the National Football League. And there weren't many other teams that had two players in that conversation. Now, you may be thinking, Andrew, Tua still hasn't proven much. Guys, Tyreek Hill can produce regardless of what quarterback is under center. We've seen that over his career to the point where we shouldn't even be having this conversation, but I'll go ahead and talk about it. Let's talk about 2017 when Alex Smith was the starting quarterback of the Kansas City Chiefs. Well, Tyreek Hill that season was the number 4 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. He had himself over 75 catches, 1,100 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns through the air, a bunch of rushing yards, and had a great overall season. If he can go anything close to duplicating that number, which in my opinion is at a bare minimum for Tyreek Hill going into this season, well, of course, he's going to be in that top tier conversation at the wide receiver position. And not only that, not even with just Alex Smith. If you go back to 2019, when Patrick Mahomes dislocated his knee on that Thursday night football game against the Denver Broncos, Matt Moore had to come in and he had to play from week 7 through 9. Throughout that span of time, when Matt Moore was the starting quarterback of this team, well, guess what? Tyreek Hill was a machine. 15 catches, 290 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns on 23 targets in that 3-week span. That's 49.5 fantasy points in 3 weeks. Again, Tyreek Hill was quoted to say it on his podcast this offseason. I went for 150 against Minnesota with Matt Moore as my starting quarterback. Tua is 10 Matt Moores. He wasn't lying. He went for 140 receiving yards in that game against Minnesota with Matt Moore. Guys, let's put some respect on Tyreek Hill's name going into the 2022 season because he has incredible upside in this respective offense. Now, my immediate thought henceforth after making that selection is, okay, are the teams that are going to select after me going to fall for the potential trap? Well, Javonte Williams comes off the board, followed by Leonard Fournette, followed by a wide receiver, T. Higgins, great pick. Of course, if you guys saw my must-draft wide receivers video yesterday, he was one of those guys. Fantastic selection there. Then Nick Chubb. Great. 3 running backs come off the board. Though I have preached in the past taking 2 running backs in your first 3 rounds, I dared these teams to take running back. And that's exactly what they did. And at this point in the 3rd round, seeing James Conner, Travis Etienne, Ezekiel Elliott, as the potential available running backs, I was not going to overpay. You have to be very careful in these specific circumstances. You don't want to overpay for a talent that you know is not going to produce as much points because you are worried about the positional run going away from you. At this point, I am 150% comfortable with the idea of taking another wide receiver because, again, why take James Conner this early in the third or a guy like Travis Etienne when I can solidify another guy that could very easily become a top 12 wide receiver who could very easily outscore the potential of those respective running backs? So that's what I did. I went ahead and I selected A.J. Brown with my third round selection. Again, this is another player that was in my must draft wide receivers video yesterday. Not only has A.J. Brown proven that he can be a top 12 wide receiver in the past, but with Ryan Tannehill under center, this guy averaged more than 14 fantasy points per game and has the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position going into 2022. If you want to hear more details, check out that video. But we're going to go ahead and move on and talk about the draft analysis and strategy going forward in completing this perfect draft. Of course, after taking A.J. Brown, I've gone ahead and solidified my wide receiver position. I know in my mind's eye, I don't have to address the wide receiver position for quite some time. And as the draft board goes down, of course, running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback are selected. And as it comes back to me, there is a specific decision that I have to make within 30 seconds. Do I address my need for a running back, or do I again manipulate the teams that are drafting after me on the 4th and 5th round turns to make bad decisions that will eventually lead to my success? Well, sounds like that might be the play, and that's exactly what I went ahead and did. Now, before I specifically explain to you as to why I chose George Kittle in comparison to other tight ends that were available, I want to explain to you as to why I targeted the tight end position in my 4th round. Now, as you can see on screen, we are back at the drop-off in production statistics that we have mentioned in videos past. Again, the drop-off in production gives us an idea as to, over the last 5 years at the running back, wide receiver, and tight end positions, what each ranked player has on average scored. Now, the information that is specifically on screen gives me insight as to when I should be drafting a tight end. Now, you may be wondering, how is that possibly the case? Let me explain this to you. The number 3 tight end over the course of the last 5 seasons in a half PPR scoring format has scored 175.3 fantasy points. Again, those are 5 different tight ends that all finished number 3 in their given year, and I took their average. If I am assuming that George Kittle can average 12.5 fantasy points per week between weeks 1 through 16 or 17, depending on how many weeks you play in a given season, he should very easily be able to eclipse that number. So, if I value George Kittle at that number 3 spot and compare him to other running backs and wide receivers that would potentially produce that level of fantasy point production in 2022, that would compare to the number 17 overall running back and number 21 overall wide receiver. Now, if and when I transition back to my draft board, I want you to closely look. There were 17 running backs and 22 wide receivers that were taken off the board. And it was an exact perfect time to not only draft tight end, but grab a guy that I'm confident in because I want the positional advantage. As you can see, the drop-off in production at the tight end position over the last 5 years on average has been brutal. From the number 3 overall tight end that averaged 175 points compared to the number 7, that's a 40-point drop-off. Again, throughout a 16-week span, you may think, Andrew, 2.5 points isn't a big deal. Those are points that can win or lose you a singular championship, and I'm sure we've all experienced close matchups as such. Now, besides the statistics regarding the drop-off in production, giving me more confidence in this 4th round tight end selection, the reason why I knew I had to take tight end is because of the decisions that were made by the 2 teams that are drafting after me in the 4th and 5th rounds. Again, the decisions they made in their first 2 rounds gave me the ability to take tight end here, because not only did the first team take Leonard Fournette and Jonathan Taylor with 2 out of his first 3 picks, and the second team took Javonte Williams and Nick Chubb with 2 of his first 3 picks. This gave me all the confidence knowing that there's no way these teams are going to take their 3rd running back. Very seldom can you get away with having only 1 wide receiver in your first 5 selections. And I know at this current time, based on the drop-off in production stats that I've presented, the tight end position, specifically George Kittle, Darren Waller, and in some conversations, even Dalton Schultz, is a perfect selection here. So I know wide receiver needs to be addressed, tight end needs to be addressed, and the fact that both these teams have 2 running backs, well, one of the running backs that I trust and I believe are breakout candidates are going to return to me. So I take George Kittle. And for more context as to why I trust George Kittle going into my 2022 season, I understand there's going to be a quarterback change. Jimmy Garoppolo is now turning into Trey Lance for the entirety of the season. Let it be known, in the year that George Kittle had his best fantasy point production, 2018, he had 3 games with Jimmy Garoppolo, 8 games with Nick Mullins, and 6 games with CJ Beathard under center. Trey Lance is an upgrade compared to all three of them, I can assure you that, and George Kittle is going to elevate his overall production in 2022. Let's not forget, last season when he came back from his short stint of an injury, from weeks 9 through 17, he averaged 13.99 fantasy points per game, almost 14 points per game, and was the number 2 overall tight end, only behind Mark Andrews, which of course ended up dominating the year. Throughout that span of time, from weeks 9 through 17, he had 6 top 6 tight end weeks within 7 games. Again, great overall production from George Kittle, and I think the limit of his overall potential only rises with the talent that they currently have at the quarterback position with Trey Lance. But nonetheless, I selected my respective tight end, and Darren Waller follows, Cam Akers comes off the board, Rashad Bateman, and Brandon Cooks. Like I was mentioning at the start of this video, I believe I manipulated the decisions of these respective teams because I knew exactly what they wanted to do. If I went ahead and selected a running back in my 4th round selection, both these teams most likely take tight end. That Cam Akers pick or Rashad Bateman pick, one of those becomes a tight end because they know, hey, if I have the opportunity to take a top 4 tight end in my 4th/5th round, I'm going to take it. But instead, I take the tight end. I force that player to not be able to address that position of need while also still getting back the running back that I probably preferred more than any other on the board, which was Breece Hall. So let's talk about the next selection. Obviously, in my first 4 rounds, I only have 1 running back. And when you have Christian McCaffrey, he practically counts as 2 considering he's putting up 24 fantasy points a week when healthy. But with that being said, I knew that I needed to go ahead and address the position. I went ahead and chose my highest running back on the board at that current moment in time, which was Breece Hall. Because again, I know that the running back position, especially in these rounds, they're extremely volatile. There is a running back dead zone for a reason. So I had to make sure that I picked the running back who I thought was a workhorse. He's going to get himself a lot of receiving opportunity and is behind a great offensive line going into the 2022 season. Again, we talked about it in the video I posted a couple days ago in regards to breakout running backs for the 2022 season that you must have on roster. One of the main stats that I brought up during that video in regards to the potential of Breece Hall. Since 2012, the past decade, there have been 11 running backs who have been drafted to respective teams who already had established RB2s or RB3s from the year prior. For example, in this case, it applies because Michael Carter last season in a half PPR scoring format was the number 29 overall running back. He was an RB3. So again, in the last decade, there have been 11 running backs selected to a team with an already pre-established top 36 running back on roster. 7 of those 11 respective running backs were selected within the first 49 selections of their given year, which of course includes now Breece Hall going into the future. But of the running backs that we've seen perform as of the past decade that applies to, 3 of them were RB1s, 2 of them were RB2s, and 1 became an RB3. Again, that's 6 of those 7 respective active running backs over the past decade finding production. And when we went ahead and averaged out those statistics, that respective running back was around the 18th ranked running back of that given year. Again, the potential upside for Breece Hall is really high up. And regardless of the fact that Michael Carter is in that offense, there's a lot of potential to be had going forward. But now that I've gone ahead and made my 5th round selection, I've gone ahead and I've built a pretty stable roster. 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and a tight end within my first 5 rounds. I love the stability and the balance of this team going forward. But my next train of thought is I want to avoid running backs unless a specific one drops to me. There are guys in my rankings that hopefully if you sign up via Underdog Fantasy today using promo code Andrew, you'll get my rankings. There are guys on that list that I would have loved to see come back to me, but did not end up doing so in the 6th round. But with that being said, the next round's positional need began to shift towards the wide receiver position as I saw running backs come off the board. And, you know, when the wide receiver position is something that I need on my roster, and Michael Thomas somehow, some way is still being drafted this low. Guys, I need to probably make a video on this. There needs to be a PSA. Michael Thomas should not be, drafted at this current ADP. Yet I am stealing him in almost every single one of my drafts. He's back, fully healthier than ever. And I mentioned it in my last draft video that I did. I mean, he's not only the king of yak, this is a guy that over the course of his career has been one of the best fantasy producing wide receivers. I understand Drew Brees isn't there. But even with guys like Teddy Bridgewater, you go and look at the stats that Michael Thomas put up between 2018 through 2019 with Teddy Bridgewater under center. Michael Thomas averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game and 10.28 targets per game throughout a 7-game stretch with Teddy Bridgewater. Again, when I get the ability to not only select the wide receiver position, but also take one of my guys, that is a great look for me. And another reason why I specifically chose wide receiver is because, again, I am manipulating the teams that are selecting after me. Every decision or action I make has a reaction in this draft. So by taking Michael Thomas here, knowing full well that, again, the teams to the left of me will either be requiring quarterback help or wide receiver help, because, again, one of those teams already took 3 running backs. One of them has already taken 2. Typically, at this range, taking a 3rd running back wouldn't be advisory, especially considering the talent that was on board, considering Mitchell, Josh Jacobs, and A.J. Dillon had just come off the board. The rest of the guys are far lower in terms of a tier than what was potentially available. So I know running back's not going to be addressed. I know wide receiver is at need. Tight end really potentially could come off the board if Dalton Schultz is required to be selected. But ultimately, wide receiver and quarterback is a positional need. I know the quarterback I want, but I am perfectly fine taking one of the 2 that were available at the time, Joe Burrow or Trey Lance. I'll take either of them. But the fact that I was able to take wide receiver, knowing that those 2 teams next to me are most likely going to take wide receiver because they need to bolster up that position, gives me the advantage once again, similar to the George Kittle selection, where I'm making a pick knowing that I am making the best overall decision and getting back the position and player that I wanted. So to follow my selection, we saw Adam Thielen, Joe Burrow, Drake London, and Dalton Schultz. Again, a tight end taken, 2 wide receivers and a quarterback. And where did that leave Andrew? Well, continuing to build his perfect lineup. Again, I have the ability to not only stack my quarterback and my tight end, I get one of the premier stud quarterbacks going into the 2022 season. I love Trey Lance. If this is me officially planting the flag, guys, I'm going to have so much Trey Lance content coming in the upcoming weeks here. You don't understand. Trey Lance is going to be dynamic, and he is going to make a huge impact in the National Football League, not only as a player, but as a fantasy prospect. Look at the team that surrounds him. Top-tier offensive line, defense, receiving core, and a running game that is stable enough to force him to be able to comfortably sit back in the pocket because of play action. There is going to be so much upside for Trey Lance, so it was a no-brainer to take him. Now, another reason why I specifically wanted to take quarterback and Trey Lance was because of mobile quarterbacks and how much of an impact they make in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. Let's go ahead and give you some more details regarding that. Now, when I talk about quarterback mobility, I am specifically referring to the idea of a quarterback being able to rush for more than 250 yards in a given season. Now, a lot of quarterbacks have been able to accomplish that. In fact, in each of the last 4 seasons, we have seen at least 50% of the top 12 quarterbacks be able to accomplish that. Again, that's 6 to 7 quarterbacks a year that are within the top 12 quarterback rankings accomplishing that statistic. And you may be thinking, Andrew, what is the value of 250 rushing yards? Well, besides it giving you 25 respective fantasy points, on average over the course of the last decade, quarterbacks who have ran for over 250 yards in a given season have also averaged more than 4 rushing touchdowns per year. That kind of potential upside of not only 25 points via rushing yards, but 24 points via rushing touchdowns, that's a 50-point influx from quarterback mobility. And especially considering what the NFL has kind of progressed into, we're seeing so many influences from the NCAA infiltrate not only the way that quarterbacks are playing, but how offensive coordinators are calling games. Again, Greg Roman built an offense around Lamar Jackson to accentuate his overall best attributes. So when we're talking about the quarterback position and the level in which they've stepped up, not only via the passing game, but being great runners and effective runners as such, it gives me that much more confidence, specifically in a player like Trey Lance. Now let's talk about Trey Lance's overall productivity last season. In the 2 games that he started, I mean, it was insane statistics that if you paced over a 17-game season, I know when you pace out numbers over a 17-game season, they're kind of crazy. But if you took the Arizona Cardinals and the Houston Texans game that Trey Lance started in, the 2 only contests that we've ever seen him start, and you put it over a 17-game stretch, he would have potentially produced 3,700 passing yards, 34 passing touchdowns, and over 1,000 rushing yards. That may sound like a crazy number, but I can assure you it is not out of the realm of possibility. This is an elite level talent, and there's a reason why they traded away however many picks it was to move up to the number 3 overall selection and make this pick. So we get ourselves a conversation where potentially Trey Lance is going to be in the mix for 5, maybe 6, maybe 700 rushing yards. Let me present some stats regarding that. In the last 5 seasons, there have been 15 overall quarterbacks that have ran for a total of 500 plus rushing yards. Those respective quarterbacks have averaged 6.47 rushing touchdowns per year. Again, 11 of those 15 quarterbacks that I've mentioned that surpassed 500 rushing yards over the course of the last 5 seasons, 11 of the 15 finished as top 12 overall quarterbacks in their given season. Now, when we go ahead and extend that stat total to 700 rushing yards, over the course of the last 5 years, there have been 7 quarterbacks that have surpassed 700 rushing yards. Those quarterbacks average 7.00 rushing touchdowns per season. And 6 of those 7 quarterbacks who have surpassed 700 yards have been top 12 quarterbacks. The only one who hasn't was Lamar Jackson because he got injured last year, but prior to his injury, surpassed that yardage total. Now, to give you some perspective in terms of the total fantasy point upside this quarterback gets from this boost, 50 fantasy points from 500 yards, plus the average of 6.47 times 6, of course, because rushing touchdowns are 6 fantasy points each for respective quarterbacks. You get yourself about 88, maybe 89 fantasy points a season. While on the other end of the spectrum, when you upgrade those stats to 700 rushing yards, that's a 112 point difference. The equivalent of 112 fantasy points for a quarterback in terms of a pocket passer like a Tom Brady, Matthew Stafford, Joe Burrow at times. The equivalent of 112 fantasy points is an additional 28 touchdowns through the passing game or 2,800 passing yards. Those are some disgusting stats that you can get tacked on to your overall production in a given year. And again, another reason why I'm taking Trey Lance and a lot of mobile quarterbacks in my respective drafts in 2022. Now let's move on to our next selection. After we've gone ahead, we've addressed 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and my quarterback. My starting lineup is set, except for my flex piece. And what you always want to go ahead and potentially do in your flex piece is get a stud running back. You want depth at your running back position, of course, because of the plethora of injuries that are going to be sustained by respective running backs throughout a season. But what you want to ensure is that your flex player not only has rushing attempts under his belt, passing targets going in his direction, but also red zone opportunity. By the time the draft came back to me, there were a couple players who, in my opinion, had the ability to do this, potentially Damian Harris in 2022. But the fact that Kareem Hunt was still available, this is similar to the Michael Thomas selection in my eyes. The fact that Kareem Hunt is being selected as late as he is right now, I'm not complaining about it. I would take him earlier. But the fact that other people don't value him as much allows me to get the discount. And my goodness, is this an incredible discount. Not only am I getting RB depth, not only am I getting a guy, like I mentioned, red zone opportunity, rushing attempts, receiving option in his respective offense, considering Nick Chubb very rarely sees those respective targets. Again, I think Nick Chubb has caught 1 catch per game over the last 2 seasons. His receiving total is not very high, and Kareem Hunt will continue to be the third down back, especially considering this offense. If they are without Deshaun Watson in 2022, we'll have some game scripts and they'll have to throw the ball with Jacoby Brissett. And hopefully the checkdowns will be there. But nonetheless, when we're talking about Kareem Hunt, in his career, in seasons where he hasn't missed significant time due to injury or suspension, he has always been a top 10 running back. He's been a top 10 running back in 3 of his first 5 seasons in the National Football League. I mean, just take that into account. I mean, if you compare that to a running back like, of course, Leonard Fournette, same numbers, same year drafted. Leonard Fournette has been a top 10 fantasy running back in 3 out of the last 5 seasons. So has Kareem Hunt. But where is Leonard Fournette being taken? Well, in the second round. While Kareem Hunt, who has proven in years past, has just as high as a fantasy floor as a Leonard Fournette, going this many rounds later. Let's put it in perspective. Last season, weeks 1 through 5, Kareem Hunt averaged 16.98 fantasy points per game in that 5-game stretch. He was the number 5 overall running back in those first 5 weeks. Guys, he's going in the 8th round and I'm stealing him. At this capacity, I mean, goodness gracious, they should just forfeit this league. Again, this is all while last season, throughout that span of time, Nick Chubb was active, healthy, and getting touches. So it wasn't because Nick Chubb was absent. He was there, and he was getting his own respective touches every single week. Just to put it in perspective, Kareem Hunt over the course of the last 2 seasons, 2020 and 2021, with Nick Chubb in the lineup, Kareem Hunt is averaging 13.24 fantasy points per game. There have been 17 total games in which they've shared the field together. This is a top-tier talent, and as an 8th round pick, a clean selection to say the least. The selection of a running back wasn't only just for my positional need. When you look at the teams that have selected to the left of me, who are about to select in their own respective 8th and 9th rounds, they again still only have 3 and 2 running backs on roster. So my anticipation is that, well, maybe both of them take running back. I need to address this position, and I need to take the guy that I want more than any and hope that another running back could potentially fall to me. Because if that is the case, then we may end up hitting the jackpot. And that's what I think I did. By taking Kareem Hunt and eventually getting Ramondre Stevenson in the 9th round as the 99th overall selection of this underdog draft, I, in my opinion, constructed the perfect draft. I have built a roster that is just completely ridiculous. And yes, there's luck involved, but there's a lot of strategy as I've gone ahead and talked about over the course of this video. Similar to a Kareem Hunt, like I mentioned, we want running backs at this late period who are not only going to get targets, rushing attempts, but red zone opportunity. Ramondre Stevenson is in that category. I consider Ramondre Stevenson in 2021 to be a budget A.J. Dillon. Let's think about what Ramondre Stevenson did last year. 133 total rushing attempts, okay? If you can go ahead and increase those numbers, because James White is on the PUP list, he doesn't look great. You no longer have Brandon Bolden in this backfield, taking away rushing attempts and receiving threat and getting himself what? Brandon Bolden, I think he had 49 targets, 41 receptions, 405 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. If you eliminate the Brandon Bolden contribution and you give that to Ramondre Stevenson, who at camp has been a big threat in the passing game for this offense, considering J.J. Taylor not looking great, and of course, James White not, fully healthy, considering his hip injury he sustained last season, we could very easily see this running back go for 133 rushing attempts to 180 and get his overall receiving total to about that 40 reception range. That is 220 total touches with potential red zone rushing upside. Again, in multiple games last season where Damien Harris was active and healthy, we saw, of course, Ramondre Stevenson given red zone opportunity and score touchdowns. Again, this is a budget A.J. Dillon that I'm finding who could very easily be a top 24 running back if, of course, Damien Harris stays healthy in a run-first offense. But imagine what happens if Damien Harris misses 5-6 weeks and Ramondre Stevenson comes out like he did last year and puts up 20 fantasy points a week on a 5-week basis before a return of a Damien Harris. What do you think happens? Do you think Ramondre gets relegated back to being the backup, or does he take over this job in a run-first offense behind one of the most elite offensive lines in the National Football League and gets into the conversation of being a top 24 back? Again, I think the potential is certainly there for a running back like such, but we'll go ahead and we'll talk about Ramondre Stevenson in the upcoming weeks at a greater clip, along with some of these other players like a Trey Lance, Kareem Hunt, as their stats will continue to overflow and give you reasons as to why to draft these players in the mid to late rounds. Nonetheless, hopefully the draft strategy that I've gone ahead and shared with you guys today on a per round basis as to why I selected specific positions and players and the stats that justified them gave you an understanding as to how I went ahead and built this perfect team. Again, I want to thank you guys for watching today's content. If you like today's content, of course, be sure to click the like button down below. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think of this respective draft. And of course, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, so be sure to subscribe for daily content. And if you guys haven't yet already, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew today. Not only is Underdog Fantasy willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit, again, a $100 deposit match. You drop 100, they'll give you 100, get you ready to go for the 2022 season. But you'll go ahead and get a personal email from me with my half and full PPR rankings updated weekly until September 4th. Again, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. Tomorrow, we'll talk about some breakout wide receivers that you have to go ahead and respectively draft in your upcoming leagues. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.